Have you ever witnessed a moment so silent, yet louder than all the words in the room? A father, a worn-out suit, a big day for his son, high school graduation, a day that should have been filled with laughter, applause, and dreams taking flight. But instead, something no one expected happened. Two security guards approached. They looked him up and down. No greeting, no question, just one line. "You can't sit here. Please leave the area." The man didn't react. He didn't shout. He didn't argue. He just held his son's hand, tightly, as if that was the only thing keeping him upright. Who was he? He was Marcus Brown, a former U.S. Marine who had fought in Iraq, who once wore the American flag on his sleeve and believed he was fighting for freedom for everyone. But today, in the very heart of the country he once bled for, he was rejected because of the color of his skin. At that very moment from the auditorium, 6 men rose to their feet. They said nothing. They simply stepped forward, eyes resolute. Former Navy SEALs, men who had once faced death beside Marcus. And in that moment, the entire room fell completely silent. What made them act? What happened next? And why did that moment cause millions to reflect on one simple word: respect? Right now, you're about to hear a story that didn't just silence an auditorium. It awakened the heart of a community. A story about dignity, about silence, about heroes who wear no capes, and about a father who simply wanted to be there to see his son walk across the stage. Let's begin that journey right now. Marcus Brown wasn't famous. He'd never been on television. He didn't have thousands of followers on social media. But to those who had served with him, Marcus was a symbol of loyalty, courage, and an unshakable belief in doing what's right. Born in Mobile, Alabama, to a working-class farming family, Marcus grew up straddling two worlds. On one side, the tough discipline of his father, who had worked in a machine shop for over 30 years. On the other, the quiet devotion of his mother, who woke at 4 a.m. every day to prepare food for the family. Very early, he learned a vital lesson. Honor doesn't come from where you stand, but from how you live, day after day. Marcus joined the U.S. Marine Corps right after high school, not because he wanted to be a hero like in the movies, but because he believed that if he wanted to change his life, he had to start from the hardest place. 4 years in Fallujah shaped him, not just into a soldier, but into a man who truly understood the cost of freedom. He had pulled fellow soldiers from mortar fire, carried a wounded comrade for miles through red desert sands, and written final letters on behalf of those who would never return home. But what made Marcus memorable wasn't the medals he received. It was the way he spoke to a young rookie recruit. It was how he always carried a worn Bible in his rucksack and an old photograph of his wife and newborn son. Throughout his missions, no matter where he was, he kept a journal. Not to complain, but to record the small kindnesses: a buddy who gave him a peppermint during a freezing night, a local villager who smiled though they didn't share a language. After 12 years of service, Marcus didn't return home with loud fanfare. He came back to be a full-time father, with a face more lined than his age and long nights haunted by PTSD. But he never lost his dignity. Every morning he walked his son to school. He nodded to neighbors with quiet steadiness, and he told his son, "You don't have to be the loudest voice in the room, just the one that stands firm." In America, there are millions of veterans like Marcus, men who put their personal lives on hold to serve their country. But not all of them are remembered, especially those whose skin is darker. A report from the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs revealed that despite equal or greater service, Black veterans were 22% less likely to receive social support compared to white veterans. Many of them live quietly, bearing wounds unseen, both in their hearts and in the eyes of society. Marcus knew this, and he didn't complain. He just kept living, quietly, steadfastly, as he always had. And then on what was supposed to be the proudest day of his son's life, everything Marcus had quietly preserved was challenged by a cold glance and a dismissive command from two security guards. But before we dive into that confrontation, to understand why that moment hurt so deeply, we need to understand the day itself. A day that was meant to be filled only with joy and pride. That morning, the skies over Augusta were bright with sunshine, a gentle breeze, birds chirping. Even the air felt alive with the promise of new beginnings. It was a special day, not just for graduating students, but for hundreds of families thrilled to witness the fruits of years of study. Rows of chairs stretched across the venue. The stage backdrop was draped in silver blue satin. A banner reading Class of 2024 shimmered under the sun. To Marcus Brown, this wasn't just a ceremony. It was a milestone that marked 18 years of raising and guiding his only son, Jalen, into manhood. A boy who once learned to speak by mimicking lines from his father's wartime journals, who once waited eagerly for his father's return from deployment just to show him a messy watercolor painting. Marcus wasn't wealthy. The shirt he wore had likely seen a few ceremonies before. His tie was neatly tied, but slightly off-center. His old leather shoes had been polished with a toothbrush, a habit from his military days. But his eyes were bright. He brought no flowers, no banners. He simply arrived sitting quietly in the fourth row, where he could clearly see every step his son would take. Jalen was the valedictorian of his class. He'd won a STEM scholarship and led a state-level science competition in Georgia. But what made Marcus most proud wasn't the awards. It was when the principal said Jalen is the kind of student who always listens and helps others. For Marcus, raising a black son in modern society wasn't simple. He once had to explain to Jalen, at just 10 years old, that sometimes people would judge him not for what he did, but for who he was, that he needed to know his worth even when the world refused to see it. They had overcome many challenges together. Jalen was once suspended for defending a female classmate from a racist joke. He once cried in Marcus's arms, saying he felt invisible among the school's gifted program. And every time Marcus would place a hand on his shoulder and say, "You don't need to be seen to have value. You just need to know who you are." Graduation day, then, wasn't just a ceremony. It was proof that the journey had been worth it. It was the day a father witnessed his living dream walk across the stage, don a cap and gown, and smile beneath the camera flashes of his friends. But then, on that very day, something unexpected happened. A fracture, a moment where joy was nearly stolen by prejudice. A small lesson lies here. The days meant to shine the brightest are sometimes the ones that reveal the deepest shadows our society has yet to overcome. Not because the light is dim, but because the darkness is so old and persistent. And that darkness stepped forward in the form of two uniformed security guards. They knew nothing about Marcus. They didn't know about Fallujah. They didn't know the nights he held his son tight because thunderstorms sounded too much like the bombs he once heard on the battlefield. All they saw was a black man sitting alone in the VIP section. And so they walked over. In the next part, we step into that moment, a moment where a single glance could draw the line between belonging and being pushed out. The graduation ceremony was unfolding peacefully. Laughter, the clicking of cameras, the principal's voice calling out names, all rang out steadily. Marcus sat upright, hands folded, eyes fixed on the stage. In that moment, he wasn't a former soldier who had faced war. He was simply a father watching his son reach for the future. Then, a shadow blocked his view. Two men in security uniforms approached. One stood in front of him, the other behind. They didn't greet him. They didn't ask for identification. "Just a cold clip sentence, sir. This area is for registered guests only. Please leave." Marcus looked up slightly confused. He opened his mouth ready to explain that he was Jalen Brown's father, the class valedictorian about to deliver the keynote speech in a few minutes. But before he could speak, the guard cut in again. Firmer this time. "You're sitting in the wrong section. We've been instructed to maintain order. Please stand up." In that instant, everything slowed. Marcus looked around. No one else was being questioned. No one else was being checked. Around him were parents dressed in polished clothes wearing badges or lanyards marked guest. He looked down at his own paper badge, wrinkled but clearly printed guest, Marcus Brown. Still, it didn't seem to be enough. The only thing that spoke volumes to them was his skin color and his old suit. In America, moments like this aren't rare, but they are rarely told. This is the kind of bias that can't be recorded, can't be prosecuted, but leaves its mark on the face of the one who lives it. It's called implicit bias. It doesn't need harsh words. It's in the assessing glance. The assumption that a black man in the front row must be in the wrong place. The unspoken belief he probably doesn't belong here. A Harvard study found that people of color are 2.5 times more likely to be questioned about their presence in formal spaces, even when they have all the proper documentation. At school events, hospitals, upscale restaurants, their presence is often treated as something that must be double-checked. You may recall the 2018 incident at a Starbucks, where two black men were waiting for a friend to arrive before ordering. They were reported to the police as for loitering. No one asked what they intended to buy. No one asked who they were. Their mere presence was deemed suspicious, simply because they didn't fit someone's invisible expectations. For Marcus, this wasn't new. He'd been asked 3 times to verify his identity when withdrawing from his own bank account. He'd been followed in a luxury shoe store, but he never imagined it would happen. Today, at his son's graduation. Tragically, it did. And it happened while he was doing the most honorable thing a father could do, being there for his child. There's another small lesson here. Discrimination doesn't always arrive loudly. It lives in doubt, in questioning one person, but not questioning others. And those small cuts repeated over time build a hurt that can't be measured. Marcus could have argued. He could have held up his guest badge and raised his voice. But instead, he simply stood, nodded, and reached for his son's hand, who had just turned around, his face-stricken eyes glassy. Marcus didn't want his son to remember this day for a conflict. He didn't want to stain the moment just to reclaim a seat. But in that calm, something unexpected happened, because some people had seen, and they could not stay seated. "Sir, this seat is not for you." At first glance, that line might seem like a simple administrative error, a standard security procedure. But when spoken to a black man plainly dressed, sitting quietly in a row of well-dressed VIP guests, it becomes something more than a throwaway line. It becomes rejection, exclusion, and more deeply, a reflection of an invisible system that never needs to shout to create distance. Racism today doesn't always wear the face of slurs or whites-only signs like in the past. It's subtler now, like a thin fog that seeps into how we see, evaluate, and treat others. It's called microaggression, small behaviors that carry negative messages toward marginalized groups. A waiter hands the bill directly to a white customer, but places it at the end of the table for a black guest. A teacher tells a black student they're very articulate, as if that's surprising. A security guard checks only the black person's bag in a crowd. These are hidden codes. Only those who've endured them truly recognize them. To Marcus, that sentence didn't just reject a chair. It denied his role as a father, as a guest, and even as someone worthy of standing equally beside others. Behind its polite exterior was a deeper message. You don't belong here. And the pain wasn't in the volume of the words. It was in the way people chose not to see him. Think of similar examples. In 2020, at a Texas courtroom, a black father was asked to leave his daughter's hearing for being inappropriately dressed, while other fathers in torn jeans were allowed to stay. Or when a black woman was removed from a flight for talking too loudly and confidently, though she was just speaking with her mother on the phone. These soft, heavy-handed reminders are part of what's now called polite racism. They don't yell, but they make someone feel out of place, unwelcome, or somehow wrong. A crucial lesson from this, what hurts most, is often not what is said, but what is implied. And like a low note in a symphony, the silence of the surrounding crowd makes the wound echo louder. Jalen, Marcus's son, saw it all. He didn't hear every word, but he was old enough to understand what was happening. His eyes darted between his father and the two guards. His heart sank, not just from fear of separation, but from a rising question. Why is this still happening to my dad on the most important day of my life? That question didn't need words, because in the next moment, a different kind of silence arrived. Not the silence of exclusion, but the silence of power preparing to speak. Because sometimes what's right doesn't need to shout. It just needs a few people to rise, and everything changes. Marcus Brown had stood on many battlefields. He had faced bullets, chaos, and life-or-death situations where one wrong blink could cost a brother in arms, or his own life. But never had his heart felt heavier than in that moment. In a room full of flowers and smiles, he was told to leave, because he didn't belong. He had every right to be angry. He had every reason to raise his voice, flash his guest badge, recite his military service list, the campaigns he had fought for this country. But instead of fighting back, Marcus stayed silent. He bowed his head slightly, placed his hand over his left chest, where the American flag had once been sewn onto his uniform, and nodded to the guard. Then he reached for Jalen's hand and gave it a gentle squeeze. That silence wasn't weakness. It wasn't surrender. It came from something deeper, a calm that had been forged through years of combat, through sleepless nights at his wife's hospital bedside, through every drop of sweat he had shed, raising his son in a world still stained by prejudice. It was dignity, a quiet strength that doesn't need to yell to be heard. In America, we're often taught that we must speak up for what's right, but sometimes speaking up doesn't mean shouting. Marcus knew that if he had reacted harshly, if he had lost his composure, the crowd wouldn't have focused on the pain that caused his anger. They would have only seen the outburst, and they would have justified their assumptions with one familiar phrase. See, that's why we were suspicious in the first place. So instead, Marcus chose silence. Not submission, but strategy. He refused to play a game he didn't sign up for. He knew he didn't have to win the argument, because his presence, his composure, and his son's gaze were already saying everything that needed to be said. We've seen moments like this before. Martin Luther King Jr., arrested still wearing a suit, offering a quiet smile for the cameras. John Lewis, a civil rights icon, beaten on the Edmund Pettus Bridge but never raising a fist in return. Or more recently, a photo of a black father standing silently before a line of riot police arms wrapped around his small daughter. Not shouting, not pushing, just standing. Yet moving millions. In a world where noise often gets the spotlight, sometimes silence is the loudest message. Marcus's calm didn't just protect himself. It taught Jalen something profound. When you know your worth, you don't need to scream for others to recognize it. And then in that very silence, just as Marcus was preparing to walk away, just as the ceremony seemed ready to resume as if nothing had happened, a soft sound broke through from the front row, a chair shifting, a pair of polished shoes rising, then another, and another. No one shouted, no one rushed, but their eyes, sharp as blades, locked on the guards enforcing injustice. They were Marcus's former comrades, men who had marched with him through scorching lands. And today, they rose not for war, but for brotherhood, for dignity, for justice. The sound of shuffling chairs was barely audible at first, but then a man in a gray suit stepped out from the second row. He said nothing. He simply stood tall, adjusted his jacket, and stared straight into the eyes of the guard, asking Marcus to leave. Seconds later, 5 more men stood, all at once, all in suits, all with the calm, composed posture of successful men. But their eyes carried something unmistakable to anyone who had served in uniform brotherhood. They moved forward, no drama, no noise. The first man, tall, close-cut hair spine straight as a drawn bow, looked directly at the security officer and said in a low, resonant voice, "That man is Sergeant Marcus Brown. He fought with us. If he goes, we all go." And in that moment, the room froze. No need for arguments, no debate, just one clear, resolute sentence. And the entire atmosphere changed. Marcus recognized him instantly. It was Thomas Kerrigan, a teammate severely wounded in an ambush in Ramadi. Marcus had carried him nearly a mile back to base under enemy fire. The others were also familiar faces. Once SEALs, once brothers-in-arms men who knew better than anyone you never leave a teammate behind. When they stood up, it wasn't just personal. It was a declaration honor cannot be stripped by doubt. We won't allow it, especially not to the man who bled, sweated, and dreamed for this country. In the military, especially among elite units like the SEALs Brotherhood, doesn't end with discharge. It isn't weakened by time or distance. It becomes a silent oath. If one of us is wronged, we all respond. What made the moment even more powerful was the way they chose to act. No anger, no chaos, just standing. A wall of moral clarity blocking injustice with undeniable presence. People in the audience began whispering. Some stood up quietly. The guard, initially firm, now looked uncertain, glancing to his partner for guidance. But it was too late. What was right had already spoken, and it didn't need to raise its voice. We've seen moments like this echo through history. In 2017, at an Oregon train station, Two former servicemen stood between two Muslim girls and a man shouting hate and paid with their lives. In 2020, a group of white veterans escorted black protesters through Louisville so they could speak safely. Across the nation, those who once wore uniforms understand. Silence in the face of injustice betrays everything they fought for. When honor is insulted, it's not just the victim who should speak. Those who know what honor means, even if untouched themselves, must also rise. Because justice should never be the burden of a few, but the mission of us all. Marcus said nothing, but his eyes welled up, not from pain, but gratitude. Because in the moment he was about to walk away in silence, the men who had once gone through war with him stood again, not to fight, but to protect him with the most powerful weapon, truth, that he did belong. And then, something even more unexpected happened, not from the soldiers, but from the next generation, from the very son Marcus had raised with quiet strength and patience. Because sometimes a lesson of dignity doesn't stop with the parents. It is carried forward louder, stronger, through the words of their children. There was no microphone cue, no official rebuttal, no pushing, no shouting, just a group of men who stood, silently, steadily, and by their very presence made the entire auditorium fall silent. The scene was surreal. No one told the crowd to be quiet. But as the six SEALs stepped forward to stand beside Marcus Brown, the graduation ceremony, once filled with music and applause, fell into stillness as if time itself had paused. All eyes shifted, not toward the stage, but toward the truth now laid bare without a single word. The entire room froze, not out of fear, but because they were forced to face the undeniable, and injustice had just occurred right in front of them. A father who had served his country was told to leave his own son's graduation because of how he looked, because of assumptions, because of an invisible bias. And then his comrades stood, not with rage, not with protest, just stood, like a moral boundary drawn in silence. That was the moment everyone realized unified action, even silent, can dismantle every excuse. A few audience members began rising to their feet. A woman pulled out her phone, not to go viral, but to record a moment she instinctively knew mattered. An elderly man in the back leaned over and whispered, "That's Marcus Brown. I remember him speaking at the Veterans Ceremony last year." Even those who had never met Marcus could feel it. Something truthful was unfolding, not through speeches, but through human decency. In social psychology, this moment is called moral clarity, a flash when what's right becomes undeniable, when actions cut through gray areas with the sharpness of integrity. And when that clarity hits a community, even for seconds, it can reshape the entire outcome of a moment. We've seen this before in history. The image of little Ruby Bridges, just 6 years old, walking into an all-white school in Louisiana in 1960 past a sea of hatred. She didn't shout, she walked, but her silence made a nation stop and reflect. In 1991 at the Academy Awards, when Marlon Brando refused his Oscar to protest Hollywood's treatment of Native Americans, he didn't deliver a speech. He sent a Native woman to stand in his place, and that was enough to rock the industry. Righteous action, when taken by a few who are willing to stand together, can hush a crowd, not with fear, but with understanding. And in that very moment, just as Marcus was being invited to sit back down, just as the security guards were lowering their eyes and murmuring apologies, just as the glances in the crowd shifted from suspicion to respect, a voice came from the stage. Jaylen Brown, Marcus's son, had been called to deliver his valedictorian speech. He stepped up, still visibly emotional, but his voice was steady. His eyes scanned the auditorium and landed on his father, now sitting among the men who had stood for him. Then he spoke, not with the anger of youth, but with the gratitude of a son who had just witnessed the most important truth of his life, that dignity had been defended. Jaylen Brown walked to the podium in his deep blue graduation gown. The golden tassel swayed gently with each step. Though only 18, there was something newly grown in his posture, as if the last 10 minutes had added years to his soul. The room remained quiet, not with tension, but with a unique kind of respect reserved for the son of a man the room was now seeing through new eyes. Jalen took a deep breath, standing at the microphone. He looked out over his classmates, then back to his father, sitting now in the front row surrounded by his brothers in arms. Their eyes met, and in that gaze no words were needed. Both knew this moment was bigger than any graduation. "Good afternoon, everyone," Jalen began, his voice clear and calm. "Today I stand before you representing the graduating class of 2024. A few hands clapped, hesitant at first, then more joined in. We've gone through so much together. The pandemic, endless Zoom classes, exams we weren't sure we could pass, and the moments we doubted whether we were good enough to keep going." Jalen paused for a moment, looking down at his classmates. Then he continued, and slower this time with deeper feeling. "But for me, the most important lesson I've learned in these 18 years didn't come from school. It came from my father." The room went still again. Every eye returned to the front row. "My dad isn't a perfect man, but he taught me something I'll carry forever. You don't have to respond to every injustice, but you must always know who you are, and never bow your head when you've done nothing wrong." A soft sniffle broke the silence. A mother in the middle row wiped her eyes. A little boy, perhaps a sibling of a graduate, looked around confused, trying to understand why the grown-ups were crying. "My dad fought in Iraq. He defended a country that at times wasn't sure it would defend him back. But he never taught me to hate. He only taught me to love the truth, to love dignity, to even love those who misunderstood us." Jalen wiped his nose, not to hide his tears, but to summon strength. "And today, when I saw him misunderstood, told to leave his seat, I was angry, really angry. But when he simply stood up, took my hand and smiled, I knew I had just learned the most important lesson of my life, right then and there." At that moment, the room had completely transformed. This was no longer a typical graduation, no longer a rehearsed speech. Everyone was witnessing something real, deeper than grades or scholarships. Jalen gave a small nod, finishing with strength and clarity. "Ladies and gentlemen, our generation may be entering an imperfect world, but if we hold fast to values like truth, kindness, and courage, tomorrow will be different. And today I know that's possible because I've seen it in the eyes of the man I'm proud to call my father." The room erupted. The applause wasn't just for graduation. It was for empathy, for respect, and above all, it was an unspoken collective agreement. "We heard you. We understand now." The generational handoff isn't just found in technology or new ways of thinking. It's found in children carrying the moral lessons of their parents and amplifying them, making them louder and clearer, exactly when they are needed most. And then as the applause began to quiet, people noticed something unexpected. Marcus Brown remained seated. He didn't rise like the others. He simply lifted his hand and placed it over his heart, where it beat steadily, as if to say, "My son just gave me the greatest medal of my life." But the story didn't end there, because from that single graduation, a ripple effect began to spread. Through the school, the community, and eventually the media. A graduation ceremony typically ends with photos, hugs, and hopeful eyes dreaming of what's next. But that day, for Marcus Brown, for Jalen, and for everyone in attendance, it ended with something far deeper: awakening. By the next morning, the story had spread throughout the community. A parent who had recorded Jalen's speech posted it online. The clip of the 6 SEALs standing up for Marcus was picked up by a local news station. And within 48 hours, millions across the country had heard the story. Not because it was a scandal, but because it was a reminder of dignity, of courage, and of wounds that still needed healing. Dignity was the first thing this story illuminated. Marcus didn't reclaim his dignity by shouting. He didn't need to. The way he stood tall in silence, the way he remained true to himself, made everyone realize dignity doesn't come from the seat you're given. It comes from how you rise when you're pushed out. We live in a world that often confuses silence with weakness. But in many cases, like Marcus's, silence is the strongest possible act. It's not surrender. It's a quiet affirmation: I don't need to shout to know who I am. Courage also shone through this story, but not in the usual way. No fists were slammed, no lawsuits threatened. Courage here looked like 6 sharply dressed men standing up. Not because they were harmed, but because they knew something was wrong. It was the kind of courage that doesn't need medals, doesn't need backup, just a conscience that refuses to stay still. And finally, just as important, came repair. After the ceremony, the school's administration issued a formal apology to Marcus Brown. The two security guards were required to undergo unconscious bias and anti-discrimination training. At a community town hall, the principal announced a new code of conduct for all future public events to ensure no one would be excluded because of someone else's assumption. Not all mistakes can be erased, but repair begins with truth and action to change. Marcus's story wasn't just a moment, it became a spark for meaningful action. We've seen this kind of change before. In 2015, a university in Missouri faced massive student protests over its lack of response to racism on campus. But after one brave black student's speech, the president resigned and a sweeping set of inclusion policies were put in place. More recently, an Asian American woman was denied service at a nail salon because she didn't look like their usual customer. A nearby customer stood up, recorded the incident, and within days the business was forced to retrain staff and re-examine its biases. These changes began when someone stood up, and a community chose to listen. Marcus never intended to become a symbol. Jalen didn't mean to become an inspiration, but the power of their story lies in this simple truth: they lived honestly. And they lived rightly, even when no one was watching. Because sometimes transformation doesn't begin with a major campaign. It begins in how we treat a single person, in a single moment, in how we choose to see people, not by their clothing, not by the seat they occupy, but by their intrinsic worth. And from that choice, the most important truth emerges. Justice doesn't appear naturally. It is built, one action at a time, one moment of courage at a time, one refusal to look away at a time. The story of Marcus and Jalen didn't end with that graduation. It lives on in every parent who shows up for their child, in every school event held with fairness in mind, and in every heart that heard this story and began to ask, what would I have done if I had been there? And now, as this story draws to a close, one final truth comes into focus. Something you only see when you step back far enough. Sometimes the greatest power doesn't come from what you receive, but from what you pass on. The story of Marcus Brown isn't just a good story. It's not just an inspiring clip to scroll past on your feed. Because if you listen closely, and if you feel it in your heart, you'll understand this isn't just someone else's story. This is a mirror. A father was told to leave. 6 comrades stood up. A son stepped forward and spoke. A community fell silent, then changed. And a country, if only for a moment, learned to listen. So why does this story matter? Because it reflects what we choose to do, or not do, every day. You might not be the father in the wrong seat, but how many times have you seen someone misunderstood and said nothing? You might not be a Navy SEAL, but you can stand beside someone being excluded, even if it's just with a kind glance or the quiet question, "Do you need any help?" You might not have a microphone, but you have a voice. You have a social feed. You have the ability to choose what you share, to amplify what's right, instead of staying silent about what's wrong. This story doesn't ask you to be a hero. It just asks you, what would you do if you were there? If you were the security guard? If you were seated beside Marcus? If you were the principal, or simply someone passing by? We often think change must come from people in power. But the truth is, every one of us holds quiet power, the ability to respond to injustice by living aligned with our values. You might never be filmed. No one may applaud. No one may write a headline about you. But one person will always witness what you do. And that person is you. The one who looks in the mirror at the end of the day and asks, did I live right today? Dignity is not given. It's proven. Dignity is not something anyone can grant you. It is earned by how you stand when others turn away, by how you choose kindness when ignoring would be easier, by how you live, not just for yourself, but for what is right. And if this story moved you, if you saw part of yourself in Marcus's eyes and Jalen's resolve, or in the silent strength of those SEALs, don't let it stop here. Share it, tell it, let it become part of what you believe in, because sometimes the right story at the right time told to the right person doesn't just change minds, it changes lives. Thank you for walking this journey with us. If you believe in the power of kindness, dignity, and truth, leave a comment, share the story, or simply whisper to yourself, I choose to stand for what's right. And remember, there are more stories like this waiting to be told. Subscribe so you don't miss the ones that speak to your heart, because one day, the next story might be yours.